Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to go through the React basics with the SharePoint framework. This will be the first time that I've actually started recording a video talking about the SharePoint framework. As you know from the previous videos, within this O365 Dev Challenge, we've been using the Node JavaScript framework. So let's go ahead and get started. So basically what we're going to do is just go back to our working directory that we have all of our SharePoint framework code. Let's go ahead and make a tictactoe, and I'm going to call this v3. Let me just do an MD for make, and then let's change into that directory. And basically what we're going to do, we're going to use the React tutorial the tutorial on the React Facebook GitHub page to actually walk through building a tic-tac-toe game within the SharePoint framework. Okay, so let's go ahead and generate our project. So Microsoft and this is all standard. There's nothing new as far as this step here. So yep, so I'm good with the solution name. Let's just call this tic-tac-toe v3, and now this one we want to select the React framework and go ahead and let this create. Now this is going to take a little bit of time, so while that's working, let me just bring up the browser here and show you exactly a couple of things that we plan to discuss in this video. So the first thing we want to do is walk through this tutorial for the intro to React, and I'm just, you can take a look at this. This is right off the React homepage. Under the tutorial link, and basically we're just walking through and we're going to create a tic-tac-toe game. So we're going to walk through that. Now to get this to line up like this perfect square, right, what we're going to do, we're going to leverage the Office UI Fabric, which is the UI framework that Microsoft is using for most of the modern UI pages, websites, document libraries, lists, everything that's modern. To my understanding, this is the framework that they're using. And within this UI framework, and this is going to be very similar to like a Bootstrap or, an Ionic framework or a Materials type framework or what was it called? Foundations or something like that. All those responsive UI frameworks out there. And I think like Vue.js is like another one that's just coming up, very popular. But basically, these are just UI frameworks that's going to allow you to create different components, right, which is a new terminology for me. And basically a component could be like a grid, it could be a drop down, it could be charting if you were using like a charting framework, so on and so forth. So here's an example of some of the components. So that, you got breadcrumb, callouts, checkboxes, so that way you don't have to worry about the styling, the animation, and all this stuff. It's going to be baked in for you, and it's going to be parameterized to where you can set different behavior or options. So in this video, we're not going to touch deep on the components. Actually, I don't think we're going to touch on the components at all. What we're going to do under the styles and layout, very similar if you're used to the Bootstrap framework, there is a grid system. And this is what we're going to use to kind of build our board as far as like the grid system. This is like your standard 12-column layout. You have the different breakpoints as indicated here. So that way you can define what the grid system should look like for each one of these breakpoints or a variation of these to represent like if you're on a mobile device or phone in your vertical view or horizontal view or a tablet, vertical, horizontal, or a large high-res desktop, and you can really control that. So we're going to use this grid system to help define our tic-tac-toe board. Outside of that, this thing is still working. Maybe it should be wrapping up here. But basically, the one thing that I've been playing, so my background, obviously, we played around with the Node JavaScript framework within the SharePoint framework, but also before the SharePoint framework, I worked with Angular 1.2-ish, right before the component model was introduced, and then 1.5 very briefly when the component model was introduced. So I think the component model is a really good model to really kind of help influence separation of concern, to really kind of chunk out the UI into different smaller components, and to really kind of define the layout, the HTML and all this other good stuff within that component, give it behavior, and be able to pass data, render data using props and properties. I'm sorry, props and state. Now that's the React model for that. So let's dive in and really see what I'm talking about. So now this V3 guy is created. Let's take a look at it within Visual Studio Code. And what I'm trying to do, okay, so this is my V2. So I have a V2. No, I'm not gonna keep that one open. All right, so this is my V3, and let me just kind of zoom in here so this is easier to read, to view. And basically, the model is pretty much, the project structure is pretty much the same. So we have the web part here. Within this web part, you have your block for all your web part properties, which is great. The data version, this is something that came out with release candidate 0. And at the time of this video, the SharePoint Framework is GA. So that's pretty exciting. But before it was released, Microsoft introduced this version piece to that. And then this is where I think some of the magic starts to happen, where, in the render method of the main web part class, what's happening is that they are creating this React component. They're setting some internal properties for that component. And this is where it's kind of confusing. This description is an internal property for the tictactoe V3 component. And what we're doing is setting, or by default, what they're doing is setting the description web part property value to that internal property. And then what they're doing now, what they're going to do is render that component within the main HTML or the main DOM, leveraging the element that they created using that component. Now, that's neither here or there, because actually this is kind of what I would say like the plumbing or the priming. And once this is done, all of our magic is actually going to happen inside of this component, the tictactoe V3 component, the one that they actually created an instance of. So this is going to be under the TXX file extension, which is very interesting because I believe this is a combination of TypeScript and JSX that's requiring that file extension. I kind of looked that up briefly. I don't have a full understanding of it. And I think just diving into this, especially coming from a AngularJS and .NET background, very kind of, very new, the past maybe 2 to 3 years, kind of heavy into this JavaScript, this modern stack format or structure. There's a bunch of tech that's layered into this, and it's kind of hard to determine or distinguish which piece of technology is responsible for what, right? So I believe this is the JSX and TypeScript that's forcing that file type. Either way, what we want to do, this is going to be our standard out-of-the-box web part HTML. And as you can see, that's tucked away within this component here and not in the web part, which we saw before previously in a no JavaScript framework. Just let's take a closer look at the imports within the web part before we kind of jump into this components directory. Now, with the import, obviously, they're going to bring in the React framework. I think most of the magic that we're going to do for this video is going to be dependent on this React library. The React DOM, to my understanding, I'm still kind of fairly new to this. This is the magic that takes the component that's created, in our case, the parent component, and actually call it or hydrate that to the DOM within the actual web part. And from my understanding, this is the only spot currently where this is being called. And there's going to be additional libraries like Redux or something like that that we would have to leverage when we start getting to Ajax calls. And again, I think for this video, we're not going to get into the Ajax calls because I believe that, just want to kind of layer in and, chunk this out into different components as we kind of learn it. Everything else is for like the web part base and the base client web part and property panes and text field that's being used, all that's standard, right? We've seen that. We played around with that in the previous video. That's nothing new here. The strings, as far as like localization, that's standard. This is our parent component. Everything we're going to build is going to be either nested within this component. We're not going to build anything at the same line, and I think that's a model that we probably would stick to even when we started to make Ajax calls. And there's several different patterns out there to really kind of, as far as best practices, to really kind of structure your project and to, encapsulate your Ajax calls into a certain component. And this parent-child model is one of those. So we're going to kind of stick to that, especially for this video. This is the properties for this component. Now, when I look at this, and I think with any framework that you're using, either it be Knockout, Angular 2.0 or 1.6, React, and so on and so forth, I think it's very important to kind of get closer to the source of that particular framework to really kind of understand the new pattern and practices and really try to pick up some of the best practices related to that framework. And I'm not sure, like from the samples, right, you just have to be careful of the sample that you stumble across, either it be a SharePoint Framework sample or a React sample or, Knockout sample or whatever the framework may be. It's kind of hard to determine which pattern or best practice or things like that they're using for that sample. And I think you have to know enough about some of the nuances and some of the tips and tricks, some of the latest features of that framework to really take advantage of or really to appreciate, are you using an older pattern or a newer pattern for that framework based on the version that you're working with. So I think that's going to be a little bit tricky. So in my case, I'm looking directly on the React tutorial, kind of walking through this, get a better understanding. But this guy, I say all that to say this guy here, I did not see a reference or an instance of that when I'm dealing with properties or props with our components. So I have to come back and really understand that. And I think this is just the web part props that we get standard to represent the web part properties. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So that was a 12-minute overview, a little lengthy and verbose, but I think it's important so that we're clear on what we're trying to use and what we're trying to build. So what I want to do now, I want to come in here and comment out this HTML block that we get out of the box, right? Because we want to replace this with our tic-tac-toe game. Some of this I want to keep because I want to keep the shell, but I don't want to keep the meat. So I want to cut this at the two most inner div containers. I think that's all. And basically all that's doing is just displaying out the description web part property. Let's save this off. Let's go ahead and fire up our gulp serve just to make sure we didn't break anything and everything is looking as expected before we actually start to layer in our custom components for React. Okay, this is still working. All right, let's go ahead and just drop our guy in. Okay, so now we're blank, and I think that's to be expected. Now, the first thing we want to do, the way that the tutorial on the React site have this layered in is that you're going to have a game component, then nested inside that you're going to have a board, then nested inside that you're going to have the individual squares. In our case, it's going to be 9 squares to represent where a player should be playing. So let's go ahead and just build that HTML out and just try to get that structure up. So the first thing we want to do is create a component, and basically this is just going to be export class, and then we give it a name, just call it game, and this is going to extend the React .component. And then as far as like the type parameters, in the tutorial they use any, where I know like in the web part they are passing in the component props, and then they're doing a void for the second option. I don't know 100% of what those are, but again, just following the tutorial on the React site, I'm gonna use any here, And then basically all you have, this is the basic structure. Then you have this render method, which is pretty standard. And then you have a return method. And then in this return function, you're going to have, this is where all your HTML lives. Now this is going to be straight HTML or a syntax that looks like HTML. Let's just do a H2 here and just call it hello from game. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is a Shift Alt F. And again, unlike what we were doing with the apostrophe string type notation and the no framework, the non-JSX format in the previous videos, this when I do a format, these tags are going to format or indent accordingly, which really make it feel like we're actually typing in HTML on the HTML page, even though this is JSX, which is using HTML type syntax, but in raw, actually JavaScript. Now to call this game component, so I got the export class and I named this guy, and this is very similar to like naming classes or interface that we've done in the past, but I think, you know, the class that you're kind of basing this off of, in our case, it's going to be the React. And again, I'm using any, which is going against the out of the box convention here. And I just don't know enough to know that, you know, when I should use one versus the other, but in the tutorial, that's what they use. Now to call this guy, all you have to do is you're going to bring this in like a similar to a HTML tag, a custom tag name. If you're from the Angular world, this is like what we did for directives, right? You know, once you create a directive, you can create, you know, your own custom tag name. But obviously this tag name and this class name must match. That's how they're marrying it up. So now if we do a Control save, come back to the browser, we should see our hello from game. Okay, so that's bringing that in. Now this is a standard HTML tag. So now what I can do is have many instances of this. Save that off. And that should repeat this for a number of tags that I have, which is cool, right? And then also you can nest these guys into this, which I think is the whole point. Now, how deep you go into this, how much you segment and, you know, kind of chop this up is really a judgment call. And I think, you know, as we mature and as we kind of put one of these projects through our application life cycle and really start to learn, you know, get feedback from developers of what's working, what's tedious, you know, because there is such a thing as doing, you know, compartmentalizing too much, and it becomes such a tedious task to maintain. And if you want to add something simple and new, you have to do, you know, certain updates and stuff like that. It becomes more of a pain than a true benefit of compartmentalize. So there is a balance of how deep you want to go with these components. Now, let's create the board one. So for every game, you're going to have a single game. A single board component. So let's create our board component. Extends React. And I'm purposely, of course, I can copy and paste, but I'm purposely typing these out. One, because I want to get used to typing the syntax. And then, you know, that repetition is just a key thing. Especially when you get to things like this render and then knowing that there's a return, and then when to use a semicolon, when not to use a semicolon, where to put the HTML, all that just comes with practice and time. All right, so now let's do hello from board, right? And now what we want to do is now we can nest our board component within our game component. Save that off. And if there are no mistakes, we should get our board. All right, so there's our board there nested inside of the game. Okay, and then and obviously just like standard HTML, the positioning of these tags is going to determine how it's rendered, unless you start to do something tricky with, with the grid layout and push and pull, and where you're actually kind of moving things around. But that's going to be pretty standard. Okay, so now we have our board. Let's go ahead and copy this guy and then create our square. So I'm going to save you the pain and actually use a copy and paste here. Save that off. And then here, let's bring in our square. And again, I'm not using semicolons or anything like that to bring in the tag. Now, this red squiggly, this is something I forgot about, but this is a great reminder. When you in this return block here, or in this return method here, it only wants one container, right? You cannot have multi-level containers. So in our case, this div tag is going to represent our container. I'm going to go ahead and wrap these into header tags. And then I'm going to dump my square right under the header in between the div container. And then the red squiggly goes away. All right, so let's just keep checking here, making sure that we're not making any mistakes. Everything looks good from game, from board, from square. Okay, so now we need 9 of these guys, right? So obviously, I can come in here and paste in 9 squares. That can be kind of messy, right? Over time and managing these, obviously we're going to start to set attributes or props to each one of these guys. So we don't want 9 of these, to kind of have to manage that way. That's just the manual way of doing that. So a better way of doing this, and this is the example that they show in the tutorial, is that you want to be able to call a private method within this board component that really just renders out the squares. And maybe, we can get as simple as one method that renders all 9, or a method that renders 1 row at a time, understanding that it's going to be 3 squares per row, right? So just kind of bouncing back to our tutorial, this is what we want to build. So we want to get these 3 squares per row. So this is a 3 by 3. So let's go ahead and do that. So my render method is going, and here's another pattern. Like, you see the render method is always the last one in the component. So anything that you add in additional to that for this type of rendering helper methods or any additional business logic, they kind of dump those before. And what I'm gonna do a render row, right, method, and basically this is just going to return a square. Okay, and now if I call render row, I have to use this. Oops, I have to wrap this in the curly bracket. The curly bracket is what's going to allow me to flip-flop between JavaScript and HTML in the JSX world. So now I just do a this.render row and save that off. And now if I want to, I can have this guy do 3 squares for each row. Save this, and then 3 rows. So now if I go back to this guy, to our web part, we should be able to get 9 squares. Just thinking about it. Do I have an error? Yes, I have an error. One parent element. Okay, where did I go wrong? Oh, I see. The same div container lecture I just gave, I got caught up with it. So let me format this so I can see everything. Okay. All right. All right. So now I have my squares. I think there are 9. I should kind of look. Yeah. And they're just layered in because I'm not defining the columns or anything like that. So let's go ahead and start to define our grid system. Now in our grid, if we go back to the Office UI Fabric, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically this is the gist of what our grid system needs to have. everything is a class name, very similar to Bootstrap. The outer container, the grid, where you're defining the grid container, it's going to be an MS Grid. Each row should have MS Grid row. Each column should have MS Grid column within that row. And then you start to define all your different breakpoints. Now, in this sample here, they're only dealing with 2 columns within the row. And they are ensuring that the breakpoints that they're defining are the units that each column is going to take up for each additional breakpoint, small, medium, and large. They have to equal to 12 just to kind of maintain that formatting within that window, within that row. So let's follow something very similar. So in our case, we're going to make the board our grid container. So we do class name. Now, here's another thing. With the CSS, it's going to be class name because, again, this is actually JavaScript that's looking like HTML syntax, but we have to use, we can't use the standard HTML class attribute name. You know, for JSX, the class name is the right attribute name for CSS. So if I remember this correctly, this is just going to be our MS Grid, and that's going to be our container. For each one of our rows under the render row method, we're going to do class name, and this is going to be MS Grid row. And this casing, I get caught up with the casing before, so I'm remembering to capitalize the G, everything else is lowercase. And then for the square, this is going to be class name MS Grid column, and then you do your units. Now, this is kind of tricky. I'm not sure if they're following the same principle as Bootstrap. Well, I think the principle is the same, but I think the syntax is a little bit different. So here I only want 3 columns from this row, and I want those columns to be evenly spaced. So what I need to do is tell each column to take up 4 units, and I'm gonna just do this for the medium breakpoint. So that MD4 is what defines, hey, I only want for this column it's going to take up 4 units, and I know that, you know, every unit on this row needs to equal to 12. So, you know, 4 times 3 is 12. Initially I wanted to do this because I would say, hey, I'm doing 3 columns on this row, so I need to put a 3 here. So I for some odd reason, I think I picked that up from Bootstrap, and I think the Office UI Fabric is doing something almost like the reverse. But either way, I think I think that's it. I think that's it. So you have to have a 4 here, so that it's taking up 4 units, and just make sure that all your units for this row equals 12 or does not go over 12. Okay, let's save this off. Let's see what it looks like. So now I get back into this guy here. All right, so that's yeah, that's all lined up, right? And if I squeeze this, it starts to collapse a little bit, only because I'm not strict on, you know, how I want to manage it. So I can go into, if I don't want that to break, I think it may be as simple as adding this guy here, but for small. And I think that's going to force it to maintain 3 columns on that row. Let's take a look. Let's see what happens. I haven't played around with this too much, so I'm kind of guessing. Yeah, so that's kind of forcing it to maintain those 3. Right, and then obviously what you can do if you want to say, instead of tic-tac-toe, you know, if it gets too small, we just want it to be tic-tac, meaning that you're showing 2 columns. I would just change this to a 6, meaning that each column would take up 6 units. And now instead of having 3, it should, I can't tell if this is doing the right thing or not. Seems like there are spaces between it, but anyway, maybe that's extra small. You know, maybe I'm missing a breakpoint or something like that. Nope, small is the smallest one. I don't know. All right. So let's do this. So we want 4. So either way, even if it's a small viewport, you need 3 columns to make it tic-tac-toe to maintain that format. Now what we want to do now is give out some more spacing, right? And we want to define each square with borders. So in order to do that, we just go to our CSS or in the SAS, and we want to define additional classes, our CSS classes. And we can do one or two things. We can override the UI stuff, the Office Fabric UI, or we can define our own and then kind of make those additional class names within the CSS, and that's what we're going to do. So the first thing we want to do is define a container for the grid. So this is going to be our grid container, and basically what we want to do, let's just make this background, make the background color just an off gray. So I'm going to do a CO, right? And then for our square, I don't think we need to do anything for the row. So for our square, what we want to do is make a min height. I'll just call this 100 pixels, right? So that way we can get enough, enough height in there. And then also we want the X to be in the middle. So we want to do a text align center. That will put the X in the middle. And what else? Oh, we want to put a border on there. So, and we're just going to do all 4 sides with the border. And then we'll just make this the light gray as well. All right, let's save this all. So once I save that, that should get converted over into a module. And then under my styles, this guy here, under my styles module or class, those should be available. Now here's another thing that I noticed in the Microsoft sample. In the HTML that they provide, there is a CSS method call to where they too are using the Office UI Fabric style names for, like, they're styling this button, but then again they have some override styles that they're defining here under the styles module, which is the exact same thing that we just done. But in order to incorporate that within the class attribute, they're making this call. I don't know why they're doing that, right? I'm sure there's a rhyme and reason, especially when it comes to like rendering or maybe possibly like updates to the DOM and stuff like that. Because I remember even Angular, right? You had that ng class or ng CSS, whatever. When you start to incorporate both JavaScript values and static values, there was some, just with the rendering piece of it, there was some special things that had to be considered. So I don't know the reason why, so I'm going to blindly follow that. And just know that, okay, if I'm going beyond the standard static class names that I get for free because the Office UI Fabric library is already referenced within this project, if I need to override those or add additional elements, CSS classes, then I'm going to have to use that funky CSS notation. So let's go ahead and do that. So basically all it is that you have to use your curly brackets because you're using the JavaScript method. Just bring that guy in. The first one is going to be my MS Grid class name, and then my second parameter is going to come from my styles class dot, and then my grid container. This guy should be there, and then I can erase everything else. Okay, so again, I don't know why we have to do this, but I'm gonna blindly follow it. I need something very similar to the square container. So let's go ahead up here in square, which has a little bit more static classes or static class names. And again, when you series these together, this is just going to be represented as one single string. And then here, for my square container, for my custom style, I'm going to just add that guy there. All right. Now let's save this off. And hopefully I should get a nice grid. Okay, sort of, kinda. So I have that darker gray, which I think is too dark, but I don't have my borders for my square container. What happened to the borders for my square container? Border, solid. Oh, no, it's there. It's just blending in because it's the same color as the background. So let's just make this black. And actually, let's make this lighter. So white would be 0. So let's make this all 3s. A little bit lighter. No, you went the wrong way with that, Deshaun. Make this all E's. The other 3s. Yeah, that's too dark. There we go. All right. And we need some padding, right? We want to put this in the middle. I'm going to save you the pain of watching me stumble across like vertical line and figuring out that doesn't work. So what I'm going to do, and this is how, once I define a class name on here, I used to just go through the dev tools in the browser and really just do any other additional tweaks. So this is my square container here. And basically all I want to do is add in a new CSS definition. So padding top, let's start off with 40 pixels. And that looks like that's right on the money. 43 probably is a little bit better. So let's go ahead and do that. So we just add 43 to this guy here. Padding top, 43 pixels. And then also what I want to do, I think in the square component, it probably makes sense. Hold on, let me put this on a new line so we can kind of see everything in the bird's eye view. So we don't have to horizontally scroll. Uh-oh. Missing my closing tag there. Okay. Let's just wrap this like in a H2 tag. And right now we have this test text in here as far as like hello from Square. And obviously this is going to be actually X's and O's, you know, as the users are playing the tic-tac-toe game. All right. Oh, okay. So now we have to adjust our padding because I think the H2 by default is bringing in some additional margins or whatever. So that's center there. So 19 is the true number for that padding. All right, cool. So this I think we're good now. You know, that's the latest change. Yeah, so I think we're good now. We have a nice balanced grid, right? Let's say it still looks good. It's responsive on all levels, and we're using the Office UI fabric to do that with, so we didn't have to bring in any other third-party frameworks to manage the UI. We have our React framework kicking in. Again, this is very simple as far as like using HTML, internal private methods to help with the rendering. And all this other good stuff, and our game tag is represented there within our parent component, which is then called by the web part. So I think as far as like the basis of as far as like creating components, nesting components, and then also adding in some styles and overriding some styles, I think we covered that pretty good. So in the next video, what we're going to do is actually start dealing with properties, component props, and component state in order to pass data to the child from the parent to the child components, and then also manage and handle click events that are managed at that has the method that lives at the parent component but is responding to a click event that happens in the child component. So let's in the next video we'll tackle that. So I'll see you there. Take care.